Q&A session. And finally, having said that, I would like to give the floor to Aurelie Skrobik, our moderator for today. So please, Aurelie, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Bram, and thank you all for being here after what I'm sure has been a long day for many people. So we're all the more grateful to have you all online with us. I currently see that we have over 70 participants and the number keeps rising. So it's a rather big group, many of whom I'm sure will have heard a bit about due diligence before. My name is Aurelie Skrobik and I work for Global Witness on the corporate accountability team. We've been involved in the due diligence directive and in its development for over 2 years now. And we're quite excited to be discussing the details of the text with you today and with such an exciting panel. Many of you will already know much of the overarching framework for this directive, so I won't be going into detail there, but we all know that this directive could fundamentally change the way in which companies operate worldwide, particularly when it comes to sustainability. So today we're taking a deep dive into the finance sector and how that is going to be covered in this directive or not covered in this directive, depending on how it's framed. And we're coming at this from a variety of perspectives, including from the Parliament with MEP René Repasi, who's the rapporteur for the Econ Committee. So I'm hoping that this will be the start of a very interesting discussion. I'll briefly introduce our panelists and then give you a sense of the format for today. And then I'll have the panelists speak for themselves and you'll be hearing a lot less of my voice. So he's not, oh, I think he has just joined us. Hello, Mr. Repasi, thank you for being with us today. I was about to introduce you. So René Repasi is a member of the European Parliament since February 2022 for the S&D group, so the Social Democratic Party. He's a professor of law at the Erasmus University of Rotterdam. He's a member of the Parliament's Committee on Internal Market and Consumer Protection and a substitute member in the Committee on Economic and Monetary Affairs and Legal Affairs as well. And he acts as the vice chair of the EU-China delegation for the European Parliament. He was involved in the adoption of the Digital Markets Act and currently works on product safety, due diligence, and competition policy. Prior to his mandate, he was a full-time professor of law at Erasmus University Rotterdam and director of the Erasmus Center for Economic and Financial Governance. His research focused on the law and the Economic and Monetary Union, financial market regulation, competition law, and constitutional questions of EU law, including the legal challenges of Brexit. Mr. Repasi holds a PhD in law from Heidelberg University. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'll introduce our other speakers as well, and then we'll open the floor up to questions. We're also joined by Ulrike Lohr, who is a researcher at the German CSO Institute SÜDWIND, where she focuses on socially responsible investment and social aspects in current EU legislative processes, such as the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive and the Taxonomy Regulation. Previously, she worked for a social impact investor for an ESG rating agency and for an international CSO network. She holds a degree in political science and economics. Thank you so much for being with us here today, Uli. I will also introduce our third speaker, Gustavo Machado, Melo, who currently works as an ESG consultant for financial institutions at NINT and as a financial coordinator at Movimiento Amplia. He focuses on sustainability issues, mainly socio-environmental responsibility, but also develops activities in project management, stakeholder management, and diversity and inclusion. He has extensive academic experience researching the role of private actors in promoting sustainability and inclusive and sustainable development. Recently, he joined the Brazilian Alliance for Research in Sustainable Finance and Investment. And last but not least, Matthies Verstegen. Matthies is the head of the Brussels office of the Dutch Federation of Pension Funds. In this capacity, he represents Dutch pension funds with European institutions. Amongst other things, he focuses on sustainable finance issues, such as the SFDR, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, and sustainability aspects of the IORP2 directive. Matthies joined from Pensions Europe, where he also focused on sustainable finance issues. He has held other roles at CBI and various consultancy firms with a focus on financial services. Matthies studied European studies and European politics in Maastricht, Edinburgh, and Meinheim, and worked during a gap year for a nonprofit in Berlin. Our number of participants has just risen to 90, so I think we're ready to dive into the questions, into the meat of the discussion. And we'll have, after the initial rounds of questions, we'll also have ample time for you to ask questions. As Pam mentioned, please put those in the Q&A, and we'll be able to open the floor up at the end and hopefully have a lively discussion with you all. So my first question is to Mr. Repasi. Thanks again for being here with us. I was wondering if you could share a bit about your perspective on the role that the European Parliament, and specifically the Econ Committee, where you play an important role, will play in this legislative process.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to this very interesting seminar. And for giving me the opportunity to present some ideas. I just left our big S&D hearing on the same matter, which is still ongoing, where we just had a panel that was looking at the issue of SMEs and financial services. So we are having now a lot of inputs that we are getting from stakeholders, and that is, I think, something that is very much here with this file, that we are getting contacted by many people, which shows that there's a high interest in what we are doing here. Now, where do we stand? Parliament is, of course, co-legislator. In Parliament, the leading committee is the Committee for Legal Affairs, where my colleague Lara Wolters is the rapporteur. And that means that it is the draft that the Legal Affairs Committee is making, which ultimately defines Parliament's position. Nevertheless, we have a lot of associated committees, and associated committees can give input, to fields that are covered by their areas of expertise. In our event for the Econ Committee, so Economic and Monetary Affairs, that is the field of financial services, meaning what in our report is mentioned in terms of financial services has to be dealt with by the Legal Affairs Committee, and if not, it can be tabled as an amendment in the plenary. So in that sense, the Econ report has some relevance. Plus, of course, the report that we are going to discuss here is not looking only at financial services, but will be looking at the entire directive. Our report will be out earlier, before the Legal Affairs Committee's report, and has by that, of course, a certain influence by the way of how we have discussed and designed this. Where do we stand currently? I have submitted the first draft report last week. It was sent around today to the members of the committee. That the amendments can be tabled until the 24th of October, and we are going to have the vote in the committee in the fourth week of 2023, so in the week of 23rd, 26th of January. In the Legal Affairs Committee, we are going to have the vote in March, so that makes it that there is a period of 2 months in which our report is basically the final opinion of our committee to be considered by the Legal Affairs Committee. So that means what we are currently having on paper are my own first thoughts, which will be quite certainly different to the final results of the Economic Committee, because now we are entering the phase after the amendments are tabled to negotiate with the other groups about the outcome. From my point of view, the following issues are here of relevance. I believe that the actor-based approach that was chosen by the European Commission was a deplorable choice, given that we have a risk-based approach that on a voluntary basis, many undertakings are already applying, presented by the OECD and the United Nations. And that goes to the core of what due diligence is about. Find out where is the highest risk in your value chain and do something about it with the economic power that you have. And it doesn't mean that you have to do it everywhere and anywhere, but according to the risks. The current draft directive does not give the space to apply a risk-based approach. So in that sense, what you will see in my first draft report is elements to change the entire directive logic from an actor-based approach to a risk-based approach. That also makes it that the special role that financial services is given in the current draft directive cannot be upheld in that same manner. Because if we are following a risk-based logic, then we know that companies have different degrees of influence on adverse impacts on human rights and the environment. They can cause them, they can contribute to them, or they can be linked to them. And financial services are mostly in the latter group. They are linked to them because they are financing economic activities that then cause or contribute to such adverse impacts. And this being linked to, and by that having an influence on how economic activities are conducted that they are financing, what I call leverage, or what we can call the leverage power, that is also not limited to the pre-contractual phase. That is also something that has to be done in the ongoing phase. But it depends very much on the kind of instrument that a financial undertaking is using, because the degree by which an undertaking can exercise its leverage powers differs whether you're a bank, whether you're a pension fund. I think Matthies is going to say something about this later, whether you're an institutional investor or whether you're a hedge fund or whatever kind of undertaking you're looking at. So this distinction is tried to be upheld in our first draft, meaning also that financial service operators will be more in the scope of the entire directive. We changed the values by which an undertaking falls within the scope of the directive. We are lowering them according to the standards of the accounting directive, but we also did not make them cumulative, as we currently have it, employees plus turnover, but made them alternative. So either you have a certain amount of employees or you have a certain turnover, or looking at the reality that we have in financial markets, we have a certain amount of assets under management. So in that sense, already the way of how you look at the scope is different. And we treat by that financial undertakings as regular undertakings, or if that is not sufficient, even as high-risk undertakings. So this is the whole idea. And the risk-based approach, which must allow for prioritization, which must allow to see that leveraging power when you're linked to is slightly different than when you're causing or contributing, has to be reflected also by what comes later in terms of the obligation for transition plans and in terms of how the civil liability rule looks like. So these are, let's say, some rough ideas that you will find back in the details in the first draft report that is now published by me. There are many others, but it's not, I have already used more time that was allocated to me, but to give a first idea of where we stand in Econ Committee and what I have presented. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for also giving us the overview of the timeline. I think that really helps put things in perspective and let us know what's coming. Ulrike, you've been involved in this even before the report was published, and you've been working with a group of civil society organizations to start discussing and asking for some of the issues that Mr. Repasi has just raised around the risk-based approach, around how much due diligence financial institutions have to conduct in the current draft. So could you tell us a bit about the shortcomings that you see in your position on the directive as it stands now?
Well, thanks, Aurelie. Yeah, we have just published a statement which will be shared afterwards with everybody, but you can also see it on our website if you like, where we highlighted some of the most important shortcomings, which I have to say most of them are being addressed already by Repasi's draft, so I'm very happy to hear that. And I hope a lot of it will be taken up by the European Parliament and the Commission afterwards. So first of all, civil society organizations very much welcomed the initiative to set up a due diligence legislative piece, because what we have seen so far is that the soft law of human rights due diligence obligations was being followed through by some companies, but it wasn't by a lot of other companies. So it's very much welcomed that the UNGP are being made part of European law, or the UNGP are being based of the upcoming CSDDD. But we did see some deviations from what the UN guiding principles said what companies were supposed to be doing in the due diligence processes. And the major shortcomings that we saw, especially for the financial markets, were first only the pre-contractual due diligence obligations, which Mr. Repasi already mentioned. Then the limitation of the value chain only to large clients, excluding the value chain of those clients, the exclusion from the need to terminate contracts under certain circumstances, and not listing the financial markets as high-risk impact sectors. And I'll tell you a bit more about what we think, why we think this is not being enough. For the pre-contractual due diligence obligations, that's not in line with international guidelines, because due diligence or human rights due diligence is not a static exercise. It's an ongoing, responsive, and changing process. And for example, if I put in my private words, if I go to my partner and I contract him to do groceries, and I give him 100 euros, and then he goes and comes back and hasn't bought groceries, but he has bought a gun, then I say, well, that's up to you. I don't have to care, because I don't have to do any further due diligence. That's putting it a bit bluntly, but this is what would happen if you only do due diligence prior to contracting. So because many of the contracts are not short contracts, for example, for big infrastructure projects like Equator Principle projects, dams, or other big infrastructure projects. They're long-term projects, and they're high risks in terms of environmental and human rights issues. So if the bank were have to look only before giving the contract, and then afterwards, after handing out the money, the contracting party would go ahead and, I don't know, use slave labor in while building the dam, and the bank wouldn't even need to look at the at this happening. That would be a big loophole in the law. That's also true for investments. And as you already said, it's ongoing market practice. Many of the private sustainable funds, they look at the companies they invest in not only prior to investing in them, but they do an ongoing monitoring. And there's all kinds of consultants and services they can adhere to, and that they can use, and all sorts of information, and they need that information for an ongoing process. One example that we saw, for example, was the solar industry, where 2 years ago, and the solar industry was in pretty much every single sustainable fund. Then 3 years ago or 2 years ago, it turned out that the solar industry was heavily involved in forced labor of Uyghur people in China. So what happens is that once you identify that risk of a company you have invested in, you need to address it, and you need to be able to address it on an ongoing basis. And the law must also set standards on how to do that, and also on when to stop. So when you do an engagement, you should also define as a legislator when it is enough. And this is what we also see that's not happening in the CSDDD proposal right now. And it also goes against the principle and would weaken the leverage of investors who engage with the companies if they only had a pre-contractual obligation. Then the other problem is the limited value chain, only to direct large clients. Then again, you have the example with a big dam. If you only have the responsibility to look at your own client, and then he goes ahead and has a subcontractor using forced labor, you wouldn't have to look at it. And that's completely against the idea of going with the entire labor chain as proposed by the UNGP. Then talking about the termination of contracts and accepting them. Yet again, the UNGP have been very clear at this point that disinvestment should be considered only when all other provisions have failed, but it should be a resort that you should resent to. And saying that you don't have to do it because you could compromise the other company is just not good enough, because a company is compromised by not being able to do its human rights due diligence. If that's the point of going bankrupt or not, then the company shouldn't have gotten that money in the first place. So
thank you, Ulrike. And I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to be a stricter
you're right.
timekeeper than I would like, and give other speakers a chance to respond to this. But I think your thoughts go in the same vein as Mr. Repasi's, in the sense that there are these due diligence standards that are established and have been set out. And in the current draft, you listed some of the exemptions illustrated by your husband's grocery habits that the financial sector might be able to use to not meet those international standards. So Matthies, I'd like to turn it over to you and hear how those thoughts might compare to how the Dutch pension fund sees this, and perhaps how some existing practices inform your opinion on the matter.
Yeah, thank you very much, Aurelie, and thanks for the opportunity to speak about our views on the CSDDD. Maybe a very short introduction about the Dutch pension fund sector. In the Netherlands, pretty much any employee builds up their pension through their pension fund, and people get quite a significant part of their pension from their occupational pension fund. So because of that, we've saved up about 1,400 billion euros in assets in the system. And it's people's biggest financial asset. And because of that, very rightfully, people have started asking questions, where does my money go? What is it invested in? So we see a big trend in responsible investment practices already starting in the 90s and evolving. And in 2018, our sector basically signed up, committed to implementing the OECD guidelines. And we are doing so through a project together with unions, NGOs, and the government in a typical Dutch fashion of everybody working together. And we're experimenting with joint engagement tracks. So multiple investors come together to work with NGOs that can serve as sort of the eyes on the ground in cases related to palm oil or labor conditions in mining in Peru. So from that starting point, we think it is logical to be part of the CSDDD. I mean, maybe to start, it tremendously helps us if there's a due diligence requirements for corporates to meet our own responsible investment objectives. But it then also makes sense to include the financial sector if you look at the OECD guidelines and the fact that there's specific guidance for institutional investors. And we think the OECD framework is one that can really work for investors. And there are two main elements, and I think they've been already sort of alluded to by René. I mean, first of all, it's clear that you're allowed to use a risk-based approach and prioritize those adverse impacts that are the most important. And then secondly, it is also, I think, pretty clear that in all but a few, perhaps only theoretical cases, a pension fund investing in a company can be considered to be linked to. An average Dutch pension fund might sound very big with, let's say 10 billion of euros under management, but that translates into a share of perhaps 0.1% of a company. So we think it is pretty clear that the link to framework applies, and that means that you're not directly on the hook for remediation. And I think it flows from that you shouldn't be on the hook for liability. Now, why are these two elements very important? And they will also be sort of the standard by which we will judge the CSDDD and also René's proposals. They're important because it is absolutely necessary to have a broadly diversified portfolio. Diversification is sort of institutional finance 101. It's how you get better risk return trade-offs. And secondly, you need to be able to invest at low costs. So we're not saying that, you know, sustainable finance or the CSDDD shouldn't lead to any cost. Clearly not. There should be some costs involved, but still, it does matter that costs can be kept at an appropriate level, because we have to beat inflation, and well, this time around inflation is pretty high. So, you know, if we can align these elements out of the OECD, if we can incorporate these elements of the OECD guidelines in the CSDDD, I think we can have a you know, a framework that can work for investors, and it helps us to align our investments with the values of members and beneficiaries. So I think for now I'll leave it at that, and I have a few more specific comments about elements that I will discuss later.
Thanks, Matthies, and I'm sure we'll return to some of your remarks and how they might complement or contrast with those that the other speakers have made so far. I'd like to turn it over to Gustavo to help us conclude this round of questions and better understand how these high-level discussions that we're having in these kinds of spaces could impact people on the ground, and specifically in places like Brazil. And what are some of the issues, the national issues, that the financial sector's behavior could influence from your perspective?
Thank you, Aurelie, for the invitation to speak, and also for bringing some thoughts about Brazil and the potential impacts of this directive in Brazil. Well, supply chains are where most human rights and environmental negative impacts occur. So usually when exposed to the international market, big companies often do not directly exploit their workers or deforest themselves, but it doesn't mean that it's not happening with their providers and their supply chains. Even though in Brazil there are very visible violations, most social and environmental problems are hidden in supply chains of big companies. And only deep analysis and stakeholder engagement provided by due diligences could uncover these hidden problems. There may be a lot of problems like labor rights violations, land grabs from indigenous peoples, deforestation, pollution of rivers, and so on. And as the market is increasingly global, these problems happen, of course, on the supply chains of European companies and companies which are invested or financed by European financial institutions. And as such violations are hidden and trying to continue without further notice, due diligence have to be ongoing, because these violations will always innovate to hide their inconformities and the problems that happens on the supply chains. And it's also important to highlight that often Europeans are too focused on the Amazon, on the Brazilian agribusiness, but due diligences are important for other sectors as well. If we look at case studies available online, we will see that human rights and environmental violations happen in several sectors. Some of them may be very expected, such as mining, construction, and garment, but others may be a surprise, such as technology, manufacturing, and beverages. Without due diligences, a financial institution could not effectively acknowledge that its lending or investments are contributing to such violations. So I would say that there are two main potential positive impacts from the directive in Brazil. The first one would be that if financial institutions' obligations are strengthened on the directive, it could avoid boosting operations which are environmentally and socially unhealthy. As financial institutions sit at the top of supply chains providing financial services to companies, their policies for lending and investment may influence behaviors. And due diligence, therefore, avoid support to companies that are not doing fine on their environmental and social obligations. On due diligence show red flags, for instance, corrective actions have to be taken, or an investment or lend won't even take place. Mechanisms as clauses in contracts, requirement on deals, mitigating actions, and ongoing monitoring are key to promote more sustainable practices on the ground, and they also send signals to the market that unsustainable practices are unacceptable. And finally, I would say a second potential effect is that maybe the broadest impact would happen through pressure and promotion of best practices, because if we look at a few years before, some very problematic companies were really pressured by investors to improve mechanisms to manage and monitor their supply chains. This could happen in the directive as well, because as we have seen with the investor pressure, some improvements we would see with the directive too. Since companies tied to European financial institutions through lending or investment would be aware that they wouldn't be subject only to a general, very vague screening. Rather, due diligences would potentially find most problematic points of their operations and supply chains, making them to anticipate some risks and therefore promote best practice beforehand. So I would say that the two main potential positive impacts of this directive in our context would be, first, this avoidance of boosting unhealthy operations and supply chains, and promoting best practices that are would generate potential positive impacts and spill over to many sectors in the Brazilian economies as in other countries as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Gustavo. I think one of the interesting things that you mentioned just now is anticipating risks, which I think feeds into a broader discussion around how different companies are assessing the risks and how different companies interact. And there have been a lot of calls in the context of this directive to create a level playing field and to have all companies operating in the same way with regards to sustainability. So Matthies, you're in an interesting position here. I'd like to turn it over to you because pension funds aren't competing in the way other financial institutions might, but leveling the playing field can go far beyond competition. And both Ulrike and Mr. Repasi have referred to international standards and guidelines and how those might affect the final text or influence the final text. So I wanted to get your perspective on what leveling the playing field means to you and how that statement or that kind of discussion resonates with you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, indeed, a Dutch pension fund has sort of a mandate to enroll everybody in a certain sector. So the pension fund for the construction sector is not going to enroll cleaners. So there's no competition per se, although, I mean, I do understand the argument being made that you don't want to have a competitive disadvantage because you care about sustainability. For us, it's also important about due diligence in our own value chain. So a pension fund will typically outsource a lot of its investment activities to asset managers, and that asset manager then in return invests in what we call an investee company. And it helps that it's clear that throughout that chain there are obligations relating to due diligence. It helps us to make sure that our intentions are also translated into actions down the chain. Talking about alignment with the international standards. I mean, I want to pick up on a few things that have been said already, but we can agree with. The continuous approach that investors take. I mean, we don't have a pre-contractual phase. we can invest on a continuous basis. So I think that that is logical and to be applauded. And also we do agree that we want to see a value chain-based approach for investee companies, so not just looking at that sort of tier one, but indeed more down into the value chain to look for the most severe adverse impacts. Then I wanted to explain or expand a little bit on liability, and I'm putting myself out there as a non-lawyer in front of a professor of law, but you know, we do think this is an important point that, you know, making shareholders liable would infringe upon the principle that a shareholder has a separate legal personality, and in principle the principle of limited liability. You know, I understand from René's comments that it is the idea that prioritization is allowed, and we just think it should be absolutely clear that if you, let's say you focus on the top 5 most severe cases in your portfolio of 1,000 companies, and you set up engagement tracks for those, and engagement tracks really work if you spend time and you know, you follow up on them. If you just write one letter and then don't care, you know, then a company knows that you don't care so much about the matter at hand. So it does take follow-up, and you have to give a deadline and maybe threaten to divest. Now, if you do that for 5 companies, 5 investee companies, it has to be clear that when there's something going wrong at number 6, you know, you're not on the hook immediately, either through a very serious fine from the supervisor or by being made civilly liable. So you know, I've not had a chance to look at the draft amendments in very much detail, but that's what we're going to be looking at. If that principle is guaranteed, then I think you know, what I've heard today is a very sensible approach. So yeah, our position for now is you know, the CSDDD, it's yes, but there is a number of things that need to be guaranteed, and let's make it happen.
Thanks, Matthies. I think we can all agree on making it happen, and hopefully in a way that makes sense for everyone. But I did want to pick up on one of the things that you said, which is having companies on the hook, and we're all here in Brussels talking about the legislation itself, but obviously there is an impact all the way down the line. And so I wanted to turn it back to Gustavo to hear a bit more about how financial institutions, from your experience, have operated in Brazil, and what it looks like when we're talking about that piece further down the line.
Thank you for your question. I would like to answer mentioning a case study that has been launched by Reporter Brazil. This is a Brazilian NGO. And last week they launched a study that found that 3 big companies, which are JBS, Amag, and Bunge, indirectly sourced soybeans from providers linked to deforestation. This laundering of products originated from deforestation was already known for cattle. So we have what we call cattle laundering, in which cattle is raised on a non-deforested farm, but it's then sold to it's raised on a deforested farm, and then it's sold to a non-deforested farm, which then sells the cattle to the meat packers, and therefore the meat packers are not buying directly from deforested land, but indirectly. And this has been happening also with soybeans, and this is what this case study has just unveiled. With this example, I would like to show you that the illegalities and environmental and social violations are very sophisticated. And if financial institutions do not make due diligence, this probably would not be captured. And 2 years ago, when I was working for the Brazilian Fair Finance Guide, we have done a compilation of case studies from fair finance guides in the Netherlands, Norway, and Germany. And in these case studies, these FFGs have researched the share of investments and lending to companies operating in the Brazilian Amazon and in the Cerrado, which are exposed to deforestation in their supply chains. Of course, the links proved to be very extensive. More than 11 billion US dollars were invested or lent to 26 companies of Brazilian agribusiness and retail, which were exposed to this deforestation. And if we also count Chinese and European companies that not necessarily operate in Brazil, but that consume products from Brazilian agribusiness as soybeans and animal feed, there would be almost 60 companies that were invested or received money from lending from these Dutch, Norwegian, and German financial institutions, amounting to 21 billion US dollars. And these European and Chinese companies, as well as the Brazilian ones, are very important drivers of deforestation, even though they are not operating in Brazil. But not all financial institutions recognize this, and they continue to provide funding, which is negatively impacting the forest and of course the climate. And these financial institutions often think that existing mechanisms are enough to identify problems on supply chains, but they aren't. Therefore, the CSDDD would allow improvements by establishing a more rigid diligence of supply chains, which current mechanisms of screening and assessment do not capture. And as you can see in my example, these crimes against the environment and the society are often very sophisticated. And this is why due diligence are key to identify how companies are really avoiding and mitigating their negative impacts and how they are happening on the ground. Many of these negative impacts could not be acknowledged without effective engagement with stakeholders impacted. And this is something that is provided by due diligences. And some financial institutions, mainly banks, already have good due diligence processes, but most financial institutions don't. In my professional career, I have met many of ones that are doing this good due diligence, but they are the minority. And even the good due diligences, they face challenges because the importance of some stakeholders are usually downplayed, like indigenous people in urban environments. And therefore, such a legislation as the CSDDD would be able to improve this scenario by making this an obligation on their side, on the side of financial institutions. And finally, just to conclude my thoughts, this legislation would spill over to several sectors, as I mentioned earlier, and providing incentives for best practices and real changes. And by zooming in most problematic cases and finding our eventual red flags, this is also a learning process for the financial institutions, because I have seen also in this my career that once they financial institutions identify environmental and social concerns on their portfolio, they usually develop policies for avoiding and mitigating such red flags. And this would also be incorporated to investment deals and lending contracts, which is a very broad and positive impact.
Thank you, Gustavo. So I'm hearing that we can agree on the need for ongoing due diligence. We can agree on the need to go beyond tier 1. But I think one of the things that you raised contrasts with Matthies's earlier point, which is that a lot of the time these practices are hidden, they're deep within supply chains, and there's a need to go dig deep. And Matthies, on the other hand, you were calling for diversification and for a portfolio that allows investors to mitigate risk and to lower their costs. So I think we're already looking at some of the structural challenges here. And Mr. Repasi, I was hoping that you could comment on some of the challenges that you anticipate, having put your report forward and your thoughts forward. And if you could also walk us through what the next steps are moving from here in terms of actually getting your ideas into place and getting the parliament in one cohesive unit in terms of this specific part of the proposal.
Yeah, let's open my magic box and show all my tricks so that the ones who are arguing against me, we can predict what I'm going to do. No, kidding aside, I found this discussion between you, Matthies, and Gustavo very interesting to listen to. Because this is the kind of discussion that we unfortunately rarely have. I do believe because we have mostly to do with organized lobby groups, not those that are actually working in the business, and that we speak too little with those that are actually in third countries and can tell us how that works in the third countries. There's a lot of talking between lobby organizations of different kind within the Brussels bubble, but I found this conversation highly interesting, and I think very important for the work that we are doing here. So thank you already now, because I believe the points of views that we have seen here, I do think they show a path forward. Because on the one hand, I have full understanding for the point that Matthies is making, that that is the big advantage of the risk-based approach of the current existing instruments, that we can look at the capabilities of each market operator in doing the best according to what they are the best in, to come to this objective that there is that adverse impacts on human rights and environmental standards are mitigated or brought to an end. So that is the objective, but that requires more than a one-size-fits-all approach, which is a bit the one that we can see under the current directive. That's the reason why I am indeed in favor of prioritization, and that this prioritization must be seen back in the liability clause, in the civil liability clause, since you cannot request basically an undertaking to go into risk by making a prioritization based on an own risk assessment and then catch them later under the civil liability rule. Obviously, if this is too bluntly formulated, it would open a loophole. So the prioritization itself must also be open to a review, obviously. But to basically set an incentive for undertakings to do a risk-based prioritization, and by that coming then to a proper engagement, and that is precisely what I hear back from businesses. So not when I'm talking to lobby organizations, but to businesses from the financial sector, that they say that they are having indeed concrete engagement pathways with certain companies. And after the conclusion of a contract, where's a high risk, there is a review of the current financial engagement in the situation within a year. With those that have lower risks, it's then maybe after 4 or 5 years, a different set of indicators. I say all this kind of differentiation makes also total sense from the due diligence perspective. So to focus all the power on where the risk lies. And here is where Gustavo's point is coming in. Because from a very theoretical academic point of view, it's easy to say there is an adverse impact, so do something about it. But in practice, to identify them and to really do something is way more tricky. And this is where I think the risk-based approach and this analysis come together. You have to identify who is the best in the entire, and here I stick to value chain, not to the supply chain, who is the best suited in the entire value chain to do precisely this job. And everybody else who is in this chain must use their best efforts to push the one that is the best suited to identify those probably in practice very much hidden adverse impacts to get them there. So and that's the point why the financial sector plays a relevant role. They have the leverage power, but it's not that they are the almighty ones. So it's also not that we can say if everything that we can have is put on the financial sector, then everything will become good. It's not the case. But the way of how it is currently dealt with is also not reflecting the power that financial institutions can have, because they do have a leverage power, but it differs very, very much from the one of a retail company, of an agricultural producer, or another one. But it doesn't take away that they have a certain power that can be used. And I think this is the path forward, with having in particular the analysis that Gustavo just made in mind, that the very point is to focus all efforts on getting to those very hidden elements in the value chain, which is most likely not the first tier, to do the best against the adverse impact. So how does it now continue here? From the first discussions that I had in Econ committee, we see a repetition of an old debate that actually belongs to the Legal Affairs Committee and not to the Economic and Monetary Affairs Committee, which is the discussion of the importance of corporate governance and, of course, the civil liability. We have a strong group of countries that are located north of my country of origin that have a certain very specific opinion about the importance of corporate governance rules, director liabilities. And there's going to be a lot of investment by them on these elements. Now, these elements are out of our own competence because, as I said, it's Legal Affairs Committee. We look at financial services. Until now, I have the impression that the role and the importance of financial services is not so much on the radar of my colleagues in Econ Committee. I do believe that's going to change after publication of my report, since a lot of my focus is on this, and I want to focus the debate on this because I also want to focus Econ's competence where they have a say. But there's going to be a broader discussion, and the corporate governance discussion is going to be one that will be repeated. The second big discussion that we're going to have in the committee is the role and the burden of SMEs. Here you have to also zoom in. A conversation like the one we just had between Matthies and Gustavo would be extremely helpful also in this SME business, so that we go beyond from just saying, look, this is just overburdening us, leave us in quiet and peace. Although everybody knows it's a PR stunt by the Commission to say only 1% of undertakings are actually covered by it, because by contractual cascading, SMEs are also in the scope. And at the same time, to basically say, if we exclude SMEs per se from the scope, everything will be great, is also wrong. Gustavo just made the point, if we want to go down the value chain where we can find it, there are SMEs involved somewhere in there. So that makes it, to give SMEs the proper place is another crucial task where debate comes in. And I find the debate way more worthy to have than the one on corporate governance, which is more an ideological one than one that brings us any step further. And the third one is the debate that we are having here, indeed, on the role of the financial services and how that is perceived. So these are going to be the three big debates that we're going to have in Economic and Monetary Affairs Council, where I personally want to put the emphasis on the financial services, but the other debates will also be there.
Thank you for helping frame those debates. Matthies, you had a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to maybe chip in because René made some comments about, the acknowledging the prioritization and the relation to civil liability. And I haven't had the chance to let the proposals on civil liability fully sink in yet, because we've seen the report now only for a few hours. One thing that did struck my catch my attention was on the identification of adverse impact. Now, Gustavo just explained, how intricate these adverse impacts can be, how hidden. So, if you're sitting in Europe as a pension fund investor overseeing a portfolio with many hundreds, if 1,000 companies, how can you understand where should my attention go? And one thing that is in the draft amendments is this proposal that you shouldn't, it says solely rely, but overly rely on information you acquire from benchmark providers or external data sources. I think if I would ask my sort of, especially the smaller members that I have, how are you going to do this? The thing they would say is, okay, then, I'm going to ask MSCI for a controversy screening, and they would perhaps pick up on the example Gustavo explained. They will certainly not send somebody to Brazil with a hidden camera to catch these things themselves. And, I think we can all agree that that's not workable. So, I would like to ask how should this work in practice, and why is relying on external data providers not a good idea in this sense?
Do you want me to reply directly, or?
Please go ahead.
All right. Now, honestly, why I'm saying this is my origin is, as it was in the presentation, that I'm working on financial market regulation. And I started working on this field since the Euro crisis, or the so-called Euro crisis, broke out 2008, 2009. And one of the reasons why this happened was that we all believed in one thing, and that is credit rating agencies. They were speaking out truth. And as a result of this, the whole system collapsed. And that is the reason why I do not believe in sole solutions, and in particular not of those that are made by any organizations that are paid by the private sector. I'm sorry. I have difficulties to trust in their judgment. That doesn't take away that there might be a need in terms of refinement, what kind of tools are available to gather that information. I believe here I can basically play also the ball back to organizations such as Fair Finance, such as SÜDWIND, such as other stakeholders that are active on the ground. So what we do need is a kind of a broad database, a stakeholder involvement of those that are active on the ground, that can compile information that is then accessible for those that are making this due diligence. What I do find interesting as a thought, it cannot be applied one by one on the due diligence directive, of course, but if you look at the recent proposal by the European Commission on the ban on products made of forced labor, they have a very interesting approach, because here market authorities have the same problem as companies to identify where actually is not forced labor, so that they can ban a product that is made of forced labor. And what the Commission proposes here is a presumption of the presence of forced labor on the basis of publicly available information brought together by NGOs, international organizations, etc. And if there is enough of information and it is not rebutted by a company, etc., it establishes basically the assumption that the product that is coming from a certain region on Earth is made of forced labor, and consequence ban, end of the story. But that works because you have with a ban a clear legal consequence. But the idea behind it is that you establish a certain standard, which is fed by publicly available documentation, not only from private benchmark companies. They can also do their work, no problem. I'm not banning them, but I would just put their powers into perspective, but add it with information by NGOs, stakeholders, international organizations, missions that are going there, having a public data bank that is available for that, and creating by that one tool that is reliable, that to which then companies can go to. So these are the things that we have to think into, that we have to think about. By simply giving a pot of money available for SME support, that's not going to bring us too far. What we do need is an extensive information on what is in the ground. But probably, especially here, colleagues that are active on the ground in NGOs can say more about the capabilities of stakeholders in that.
Thank you, Mr. Repasi, and I think that this connects to the work of a lot of people in the CSO sector and people who are active in publishing reports and publishing information that then becomes publicly available for different companies to use and to help inform different plans and actions. So I think that's definitely very relevant to many of the people here in this call. I'd like to hand it over to Ulrike to talk about another argument that we hear a lot, or another point of contention, which is that the financial sector already faces a lot of different regulatory constraints, and that other frameworks like the CSRD or SFDR are already allowing financial sector institutions to conduct due diligence. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Well, it is true that the financial sector is facing a lot of new regulation and sustainability regulation, especially, and a lot of it has not been fully developed yet. So I do have a certain understanding of financial sector participants saying, "Oh no, not yet again another regulation." But when we think about the CSDDD, it comes from a different angle. It comes, so that's the thinking that companies have a responsibility to do human rights due diligence, and financial institutions are also companies. They may have a different linkage to it. They might be directly linked, they might be contributing, or they might be causing human rights violations. That, and their responsibilities to address those issues might be different, but they are market participants, and thus they should be covered by CSDDD. In parts, they are some of the issues are already covered by the other regulations that you mentioned, for example, SFDR, but it doesn't cover, first, it doesn't cover the entire financial sector. SFDR is for investors, so it doesn't really cover credits, as project finance, for example. It's not for that, it's for funds. And as the name says, it's a sustainable finance disclosure regulation, so it has weaknesses and loopholes on how due diligence measurements should be taken, and this needs to be spelled out in CSDDD. And also, I would like to take up an argument that was posed yesterday in the presentation of the platform on financial sustainable finance, presenting the sustainable the social minimum safeguards, because they said that all the what they said is that all the different regulations have to fit in together, and they expect from CSDDD full adherence to the UNGP principles, and if this is set up for all the different companies, this could serve as a proxy for adherence to minimum social safeguards. So if we take out the financial sector out of the equation, then the minimum social safeguards wouldn't work for that sector. So you would have to fit it in yet again in another requirement. So this is just for another compliment. But I'm very curious to hear also by Mr. Repasi what he thinks about that, and some further questions that Aurelie will be putting.
Thanks, Ulrike, and I think that's a good opportunity to hand over to Mr. Repasi to close the moderated rounds of questions, and then we can open it up to participants. But it's also a question that we're getting in the Q&A now, so I will direct it to you. Could you also comment on the other regulations and how they might interact for the financial sector, specifically with the due diligence regulation? And we're also hearing some pushback from the council's side based on information that was released in Politico yesterday on financial actors. And I think that's also motivated by a similar line of argumentation. So looking forward in the year ahead and getting this piece of regulation or this directive over the line, could you also share a bit about how you anticipate the Parliament might interact with other institutions like the Council?
Yeah. No, I can basically just concur with what Lohr was saying on the relationship. The point with other legal acts, they have different scopes. On SFDR, it was mentioned, this is about institutional investors. And the setup of obligations is a different the SFDR or also the CSRD, you do have reporting and transparency obligations. Due diligence is more than reporting. That's what we have just discussed. We do not want to have ticking the box exercise. We want to have that best efforts are employed in order to bring adverse impacts to an end or mitigate their effects, the impact to the biggest extent possible. That's a different set of obligations than the one on the other, under the other legal acts. Yet the information that you gather from the other legal acts is necessary and to be used in order to fulfill these obligations that are defined under due diligence. So that is, in that way, we have to see how those legal acts do interact. What we have to have a clear look at is that we do not create a different set of information gathering obligations under due diligence that is actually met in a different way by different techniques under the other regulations, because then we only double or triple the information gathering exercise. That's not necessary. And that is actually also not intended by the due diligence directive. And for me, this is also not that visible in the directive. Therefore, also, I'm not in favor of a total exclusion of institutional investors. So the position of the German government, let's be frank, they came up with the idea to exclude institutional investors from the scope. Knowing all those nice proposals sent to me unwanted about how I should redraft the text of the due diligence directive, I know where this is coming from because I have seen it already. But okay, that's then for the German government to justify why they take the same wording that I have seen in lobbyist papers. It nevertheless doesn't take away that the logic speaks against such an exclusion, because the set of obligations is a different one, because the leverage power of financial operators is accepted even by themselves. We had just in the hearing that I was coming from the S&D group, a representative from ABN AMRO, which is a huge Dutch bank, that clearly says they have due diligence operations already in place, not only in pre-contractuals, but also after the conclusion of the contract. And they do a risk-based approach. They treat certain parts of their portfolio differently than others. So this is happening already on the ground, and it has effects. And therefore, why should we now exclude them from the due diligence directive, whereas we can see it A, works, and B, it has effects. It might not work in a precise manner as the Commission has put it in the draft directive, okay, that we can discuss, and then we adjust the way of how this is done, and particularly going more into the direction of risk-based approach. But the total exclusion is missing the point, because the due diligence directive is something else than SFDR or CSRD.
Thank you, Mr. Repasi. And I think it's clear from your remarks and from the others in this webinar that the exclusion of financial institutions is not the desirable outcome moving forward. So there is the need for ongoing due diligence. There is the need to remove the exemptions that are currently listed for financial institutions in the draft. But we also touched on some interesting questions, including how we can meaningfully engage stakeholders and how we can ensure that we identify problems all the way down the value chain. So I think those will be food for thought. And I think we were able to also touch on some other important issues, like how the due diligence directive might play out in reaction or in contrast with other directives that apply in the financial sector. So a lot covered in a fairly short amount of time. I'd like to open it up for questions either from panelists to one another or from participants. You can put your questions in the Q&A box. You can also try and ask for permission to open your camera and speak. So I'll wait for some questions to trickle in. And I also see that Gustavo already has a hand up, so I'll hand it over to him. And then we'll be reading some questions out from the audience.
Thank you. Well, I would like just to bring some thoughts on what Matthies has raised regarding the how should financial institutions do it practically, how it would work in practice. So what I want to bring is there is a screening process prior to the investment in the case of pension funds. And this is already going to avoid the entrance of some environmental and social risks on the portfolio. So what we are defending here is, of course, having an ongoing due diligence, but what is done also prior to the investment, prior to lending. This is important as well, because it may avoid some errors and some ENS risks on your portfolio. And usually what I see from financial institutions is like this controversy screening that you mentioned, like consulting rep risk and seeing what's going on. And I would also like to dialogue with a comment on the Q&A. Almudina from FIAN has mentioned it on the Q&A that a work that the NGO has been doing in Brazil. There are lots of NGOs in Europe and in other places as well, exposing problems, and this should be, you should have track these reports and media, of course, and this could trigger a closer verification or engagement with an investee if such reports, if this information that you may reach easier brings you red flags regarding one or other investee. And of course, what is very important as well is monitoring always. So there are several databases that can be global or that they can be national, and this happens in all countries mostly, that if you as institutional investors strengthen your like data science and this monitoring, this can avoid further costs. For example, that I see this is a concern for you. So maybe we are a small pension fund, like a small staff, but we have to do a lot regarding our due diligences. But if you strengthen and automatize such processes, this can help you. But it's necessary that sometimes a few investees where you probably will raise some red flags should be selected for a closer zoom in, for maybe hiring a consultancy to verify and make such a due diligence on them. This is something that you have to do, but of course there are some processes beforehand that are not very cost intensive that you can strengthen your the financial institutions to make a good due diligence as well. So I hope I helped you in some way, and I am also open to bring more thoughts about it.
Thanks, Gustavo. And I think, Matthies, it's worth saying also that in the chat, in addition to what Gustavo highlighted, there are a lot of civil society organizations that have volunteered that they produce different reports and types of data sets to help make this information available. So I think there is also a genuine and intense effort from the civil society side to make that information more widely heard on the company side too. I might just open the floor up to a different set of questions, which helps us shift gears a little bit and speak to another point that's really important, I think, which is around the climate and how financial institutions might be involved in the climate crisis or might contribute to the climate crisis. So the question is, how can this directive and financial institutions under this directive help us tackle the climate crisis?
Do you want me to respond to that on behalf of, well, I will not respond on behalf of the entire financial sector. I mean, you do see from many pension funds, at least, commitments and action on decarbonization of the portfolio. Now the CSDDD might spur this. I would say that, you know, in the end, the pension fund remains invested in, you know, in broadly the economy. You see already more and more exclusion of fossil fuels, but still, you know, it especially if you start measuring scope 2 and 3 as well, you know, in the end, we can only go a little bit faster than we can decarbonize our portfolios a little bit faster than the overall economy, but we cannot, you know, the only thing we could do is only invest in tech and then sell everything else, and then you would have a great, you know, a great score for your portfolio, but that doesn't, you know, help in the real world either. So I think, you know, what is being proposed might spur action in the financial sector, but I think the transition plans of financial actors should be judged against, you know, what is possible, where the entire economy is standing at, and there should be a relationship there.
Thanks, Matthies. So helping accelerate and trigger a process that I think is much needed, given the information that we have around the climate crisis. Are there any comments from any of the other panelists?
Yes, just briefly also answering to this climate question. Well, I think, as I mentioned before, this is a learning process, and on these due diligences are obligations. Financial institutions may also uncover the climate effects of their investments and lending, and therefore this could be also in the long run some kind of avoiding emissions, because they will uncover that climate problems that maybe they haven't acknowledged before a due diligence. And just giving you example, in Brazil, the main factor of carbon emissions are changes on the land use, and if due diligence are done in a proper manner, this could be avoided, like conversion of forest land into a farming land, for instance. So I think it's all tied to the directive, and of course this could be an indirect output of this directive.
Thanks, Gustavo. So in a similar vein, influencing the actions and the outcomes on the ground. Mr. Repasi, the next question is directed to you around the econ report specifically. If a risk-based approach is to be taken, why are financial institutions or undertakings considered high risk themselves, rather than describing particular due diligence obligations vis-a-vis companies from actual high risk sectors, i.e. that actually cause or contribute to adverse impacts?
Yeah, the very fact that I have included the financial sector as a high-risk sector has something to do with the logic of the proposal, because the proposal is an actor-based proposal, meaning the personal scope of the directive is linked to the company size. And it's the very nature of many financial market operators that they are just not having the size, neither in terms of turnover nor in terms of employees. Means if in the logic of the directive, you do not qualify a sector as high risk, you have to live with high thresholds. And that's the reason for this choice. In my vision of how the directive should look like, there would be no need to distinguish between low risk or high risk sectors, because the scope would be defined broader, and then there would be no need for this distinction. So that is the first part of the question. The second part of the question, as I understand it, is we do have due diligence obligations in the current draft that are in rather abstract terms. And I understand the question now why they are not more specific. This is, let's say, the problem that you always have as a legislator, that how specific should you get when you do that, when you do legislation. You make clear that there is an obligation to bring adverse impacts to an end, to mitigate the effects, if not possible, to mitigate its effects to the biggest extent, and that companies have to show their best efforts in order to realize this. These are terms with which lawyers can work. And I think this is the most relevant one, that it's clear where this must be guided. Ultimately, to then already prescribe a set of tools for certain companies would first of all create legal uncertainty. What is with the tools that are not mentioned? And I also don't think that this is necessary. I do see potential for being more specific, and that relates to the previous question. When we are looking at the climate change transition plans, so the Article 15 of the directive might need to be more specific. We might want to include, but the question was now about causing and contributing. When we look at the leverage power of financial institutions to make sure that making use of voting rights, making use of engagement policies is also a tool that in itself, if well used, is sufficient in order to meet the requirements. Because as Matthies was saying, pension funds have limited possibilities, but these possibilities should be used, and it must be clear that that's also fine. So here I do see still some margin for more specification, but I do believe that the broadness of the notions here is in itself sufficient.
Thank you, Mr. Repasi. Matthies, I'm going to give you 2 minutes.
Okay, I just
I'll
want
have
to
wrap up.
quickly chime in on the thresholds, because I think, as René rightfully identified, having a 500 employee threshold might not be always the most relevant for financial sector players. But I do want to say that if I read the proposal, your proposals correctly, a pension fund would be in scope as of 10 million euros balance sheet total. And if I read that correctly, that is an extremely small pension fund. I mean, like in the Netherlands, we talk about small as everything under 500 million or maybe even 1 billion. So, maybe a little bit more thinking about how the exact tweaks or should be made on the balance sheet and the different thresholds you can have. Yeah, that is then for the weeks to come.
Mr. Repasi, would you like to quickly respond before I...
Of course, you should not forget what's the point of a first draft of report. The point of a first draft of report is not to be the final report, but it's about shaking a lot of trees and seeing what falls down. And obviously, I made the right choice.
Thank you, Mr. Repasi. I think that can stand as our last thought for today's webinar in terms of shaking things up and changing the way that current corporate behavior operates and the impact that has on both humans and the environment. So thanks for reminding us. I'd like to hand it back over to Ulrike to close us off, and thank you all for joining us today, everyone who is online for having lasted so long. I know that it's late for many of you, and to all of the speakers for the insightful interventions, and I'm sure Ulrike will reiterate some of my gratitude.
Well, thank you so much for being our moderator today. That was, for me, was very, very interesting and very helpful discussion today to highlight a few different points of view. I hope other participants and also had an interesting time and took something away with it. Mr. Repasi, thank you very much again to you for taking your time and enlightening us to you. I wish you a very good and hard discussions over the coming weeks. For everybody, I just would like to reiterate that we have just published our statement today. I hope people can see it in the chat. If you can't find it, you will receive an email tomorrow with a recording of the a link of the recording of our webinar. So if there's anything that you might to recap today, you can do that by yourself via YouTube, and also read the statement. For this, I'm looking forward to further discussions. I think there's a lot to be talked about and how to strengthen the role of the financial sector in CSDDD, and I look very much forward on how the final piece of legislation will look like once it's through everything. Thank you very much and have a good evening.
Thank you.